480 BCE. 300 bodies lay stacked in a mountain pass, barely wide enough to breathe. Bronze armor split open, spears snapped, shields crushed into the dirt, blood pooled so thick it darkened the stones of Thermopylae. Behind them stood an army so vast it blurred the horizon. Persia's war machine, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, already moving west, already convinced the world, had been decided. To Xerxes, this was proof that courage could be admired and erased, proof that resistance could slow empire but never stop it, proof that Greece, fractured and defiant, would eventually kneel. But here's what the chronicles don't tell you. Thermopylae was not the end of Spartan fury, it was the moment it began to ferment. Because while Persia marched forward celebrating victory, Sparta did something far more dangerous than rage. It went silent. And in Sparta, silence was never weakness, it was preparation. What happened in the months after Thermopylae is rarely spoken about with the same reverence as the stand of the 300. There are no statues carved for it, no speeches memorized by schoolchildren. Yet this is where the real story begins, because this is where vengeance stopped being emotional and became strategic. Ask yourself this. If 300 men could hold back an empire for days, what would 10,000 do if given time? What would happen if Sparta stopped dying gloriously and started killing efficiently? What would happen if Persia, drunk on victory, misunderstood what Thermopylae truly meant? Because Persia believed the Spartans had spent themselves, that Leonidas's sacrifice had emptied Sparta of its spine, that no city could absorb such a loss and return stronger. This was their fatal mistake. Sparta did not mourn the way other cities mourned. There were no public laments, no long funerals. Mothers did not collapse in grief. Fathers did not curse the gods. Instead, names were spoken once, quietly, and then never again. Because in Sparta, the dead were not honoured with tears. They were honoured with action. Every Spartan child had grown up knowing death was not the worst fate. Dishonour was. And Thermopylae had not been dishonourable. It had been incomplete. The story had been cut short, and Sparta intended to finish it. While Persia burned Athens and paraded through Greece, something was happening behind the walls of Lacedaemon that terrified even Sparta's allies. For the first time in living memory, the full Spartan levy was being prepared. Not 300, not a token force, not a symbolic stand. 10,000 Spartiates, men forged from the Agog, veterans of drill yards and border wars, warriors who had trained since the age of 7 to endure hunger, pain, and terror without breaking formation. Men who did not fight for glory, but for outcome. And they were not gathering to defend a pass. They were gathering to hunt. But before Sparta could strike, it had to wait. And waiting was agony, because Persia still dominated the map. Xerxes had withdrawn east after Salamis, but he left behind a massive force under his most trusted general, Mardonius. This was not a reckless commander. This was a man who understood Greek politics, Greek pride, Greek fear, and Mardonius was confident. He believed Greece would tear itself apart, that cities would argue over leadership, that alliances would rot under pressure, that Sparta, cautious and slow, would hesitate once again. From his perspective, Thermopylae had revealed the truth. The Spartans were brave but predictable, strong but rigid, dangerous only when cornered. Mardonius believed time was on his side, and so he waited. He devastated the countryside. He harassed supply lines. He sent cavalry to poison wells and burn crops. He watched Greek commanders argue while their men grew hungry and restless. Every delay made Persia stronger. Every hesitation made Sparta's vengeance burn hotter. This is where history gets uncomfortable, because Sparta was not eager to rush forward. It was calculating, watching, learning. Thermopylae had taught them a brutal lesson, that courage without timing was suicide, that sacrifice without control was waste. Leonidas had not died to inspire poetry. He had died to expose Persia, and Sparta intended to use that knowledge. Slowly, The Greek coalition formed, not because they trusted one another, but because they feared what would happen if they stood alone. At its heart stood the Spartan core, unyielding, silent, terrifyingly disciplined. Around them gathered allies who knew one thing for certain. If Sparta was marching north in force, something irreversible was coming. But the battle did not come quickly. Weeks passed. Maneuvers shifted. Skirmishes erupted. Persian cavalry struck and vanished. Greek lines adjusted and withdrew. To Persian scouts, it looked like confusion, weakness, cracks forming under pressure. Mardonius smiled. He believed he was watching the same pattern unfold again. Greeks retreating, Greeks second-guessing, Greeks losing the will to commit. He believed the war would end without a decisive clash. He was wrong, because what the Persians interpreted as collapse was choreography. And at the centre of it stood 10,000 Spartans, waiting for the moment when Persian confidence would finally outrun Persian caution. The stage was being set. The debt of Thermopylae was about to be collected, but not yet. Mardonius believed he understood the Greeks. He believed their alliances were fragile, their unity artificial, their courage conditional. He believed they would posture, argue, retreat, and fracture the moment pressure became unbearable. And from the hills of Boeotia, it appeared he was right. The Greek army shifted positions constantly. Camps were moved under cover of night. Supply lines stretched thin. Messengers rode back and forth carrying conflicting orders. To Persian eyes, it looked like fear. But here's what the chronicles don't tell you. Spartan fear never looked like panic. It looked like patience. The Spartans had learned something at Thermopylae that no other Greek city truly grasped. Persia could not be stopped by standing still. Persia could not be bled by dying in place. The empire thrived on attrition, on time, on momentum. If Greece was to survive, Persia had to be broken in motion, forced into a fight it could not control. That meant denying Mardonius what he wanted most, a battle on his terms. For weeks, both sides circled each other across the plains near Plataea. The Persians occupied open ground, ideal for cavalry, archers, and mass manoeuvre. The Greeks clung to higher terrain where Persian horses struggled and missile fire lost its edge. Every day, without battle, frustrated Mardonius more. Every day, without decisive action, fed his arrogance. He sent envoys. He promised mercy. He promised autonomy. He promised power to those who broke ranks. Sparta did not respond. Silence again. And silence, to Persia, felt like indecision. This was the fatal flaw of empire. Persia believed resistance was always loud. That rebellion announced itself, that enemies needed to shout their defiance to feel brave. Sparta had no such need. Instead, they watched Persian supply problems worsen. They observed how cavalry harassment could not dislodge disciplined hoplites from broken ground. They measured the arrogance in Persian patrol patterns, the looseness in their formations, the assumption that the Greeks would eventually retreat south. And then quietly, the Spartans began to move, not forward, backward. In the darkness of night, the Greek army executed a complex repositioning. Units were ordered to withdraw from exposed positions to more defensible ground. Water sources were secured. Lines shortened. Signals passed hand to hand, voice to voice, without confusion. To Mardonius, dawn revealed exactly what he wanted to see. Empty ground, retreating Greeks, a battlefield abandoned. He did not hesitate. This is where history gets uncomfortable. Because the moment Mardonius saw Greek lines shifting, he believed the war had already been won. He ordered an immediate advance, abandoning his fortified camp and structured battle plan. Persian infantry surged forward, cavalry racing ahead, eager to crush what they believed was a fleeing enemy. Discipline dissolved into momentum. Formations stretched. Command lagged behind movement. And then the ground changed. The Greeks had not retreated in disorder. They had repositioned into killing terrain. Suddenly, Persian cavalry found itself funneled into broken ground where speed became useless. Arrows lost their effectiveness as Spartan shields. locked together. The narrow approaches nullified numerical advantage, and before Mardonius could reassert control, the Greek line stopped retreating. It turned. 10,000 Spartans stepped forward as one. No roar, no charge cries, no frenzy, just shields interlocked, spears levelled, feet moving in unison. What happened next shocked even their enemies. Persian infantry, trained to overwhelm through volume and missile fire, smashed into a wall that did not yield. Spears punched through wicker shields and linen armour. Men fell forward into their own ranks. The weight of the advance turned into suffocation. This was not Thermopylae. There was no pass to die in. There was room to manoeuvre, and Sparta used every inch of it. The Spartans advanced slowly, methodically, crushing resistance step by step. Where Persian troops broke, Spartan discipline held. Where Persian units hesitated, Spartan pressure increased. Allied Greek forces followed the Spartan lead, emboldened by the sight of Persia bleeding in open battle. Mardonius tried to rally his men. He rode into the chaos, striking soldiers with his spear, shouting orders, demanding courage. But courage was not what Persia lacked. It was cohesion, and cohesion was what Sparta destroyed first. Persian lines began to fragment, units fought independently, commands contradicted each other, dust and noise swallowed orders before they reached the front. The battlefield became a series of isolated struggles, and in isolated combat, Persian infantry stood no chance against men who had trained their entire lives for close quarters killing. Still, the battle did not end. Persia had numbers. Persia had reserves. And Persia believed sheer mass would eventually tell. But here's the part rarely emphasized. Sparta did not rush. They advanced. When the line held, they paused when it wavered. They killed without chasing. They did not pursue fleeing enemies into disorder. They maintained formation, because Sparta was not trying to win quickly. They were trying to break Persia permanently. Hour after hour, the pressure mounted. Persian soldiers fought bravely, but bravery without structure is just noise. And slowly, unmistakably, the realization spread through the Persian ranks. This enemy would not collapse. This enemy would not panic. This enemy was not impressed by numbers. And then, in the chaos of the fighting, Mardonius fell, struck down amid his guards, crushed under the weight of his own army's retreat. Persia lost not just a general, but its nerve. Leadership disintegrated. Signals stopped flowing. Units withdrew without coordination. What had begun as an advance turned into a rout. The Spartans did not pursue recklessly. They advanced relentlessly. The Persian camp was overrun. Fortifications meant to protect became traps. Soldiers died in masses as exits clogged and panic spread. The battlefield became a graveyard, stretching farther than Thermopylae ever had. By the time the fighting ended, the impossible had happened. The army that had crushed Leonidas had been shattered, and the debt of Thermopylae was finally being paid. But the story does not end with victory, because what Sparta did next ensured Persia would never recover its confidence in Greece. The collapse did not come all at once. It unravelled. Persian soldiers who had marched into Greece believing themselves instruments of destiny now found themselves trapped by their own numbers. Tents became dead ends. Supply wagons blocked escape routes. Command posts were abandoned as officers vanished into the chaos. The discipline that had carried Persia across continents dissolved under pressure it had never faced before, because Persia had never faced an enemy that refused to break. The Spartans pressed forward without shouting victory, without celebrating, without chasing glory. They moved like a tide, with a single direction, forcing the Persians backward into their own camp, where panic multiplied, faster than fear ever could on open ground. This is where history gets uncomfortable, because what followed was not a heroic clash of equals. It was methodical destruction. Persian troops attempted to rally behind makeshift defences, but Spartan hoplites smashed through them with terrifying efficiency. Shields locked, spears thrust. Short swords finished what spears began. There was no room for Persian archery to matter, no space for cavalry to manoeuvre, no time to reorganise. Every attempt at resistance collapsed under pressure that never relented. The Spartans did not stop when the enemy turned. They stopped only when the enemy ceased to exist as a fighting force. By midday, the Persian camp was no longer a camp. It was a maze of broken bodies, shattered equipment, and silence punctuated by the cries of the wounded. Survivors fled in scattered groups, abandoning banners, armour, even weapons, just to escape the killing ground. And all the while, the Spartans advanced, not because they hated Persia, but because they understood something Persia never had, that mercy at this moment would invite return. The psychological impact was immediate. News travelled faster than armies ever could. Persian forces, stationed across Greece, began to withdraw preemptively, unwilling to face an enemy that had broken the main host in open battle. Cities that had once submitted out of fear now revolted. Garrisons vanished overnight. The illusion of Persian inevitability cracked everywhere at once. For years, Persia had conquered, by reputation as much as force. Now that reputation was bleeding, and Sparta knew it. The Greeks gathered after the battle in stunned disbelief. Many had expected to die. Some had believed defeat inevitable. They had marched behind the Spartans because there was no other option, not because they were confident in victory. Now they stood among the ruins of an empire's ambition. The name Thermopylae resurfaced, not as a symbol of loss, but as a prelude. The 300 were no longer remembered as the men who died. They were remembered as the men who set the trap, because Thermopylae had never been about stopping Persia. It had been about teaching Sparta how Persia fought, how it relied on momentum, how it assumed enemies would collapse under pressure, how it mistook courage for recklessness. The 10,000 had taken those lessons and turned them into a weapon, but victory carried consequences. Sparta had proven it could break an empire, but in doing so it had exposed something dangerous, not just to Persia, but to Greece itself. Power like this demanded unity, discipline, control, and Greece was not known for any of those things. As the Persian threat receded, old rivalries resurfaced. Allies who had fought side by side now argued over credit, spoils, influence. Athens and Sparta eyed each other with suspicion, each aware that the other now commanded enormous prestige. The seeds of future conflict were already sprouting in the soil of victory. Yet in that moment, standing among the wreckage of Persia's ambition, one truth was undeniable. The world had changed. The unstoppable had been stopped. Not by gods, not by destiny, but by men who had learned how to turn loss into strategy. Thermopylae had been a sacrifice. Plataea had been a reckoning. And together they proved something that echoed far beyond Greece. Empires do not fall when they meet resistance. They fall when they believe resistance has already failed. In the years that followed, Persian scribes would struggle to explain what happened in Greece. They could record numbers. They could list casualties. They could describe the collapse of Mardonius's army and the sudden withdrawal of Persian power from the Aegean. But none of that captured the true wound, because the real damage was not physical. It was psychological. For the first time since the rise of Persian expansion, an enemy had not merely resisted. It had learned, adapted, and then struck back with intent so precise that it unravelled an entire campaign in a single day. This was not supposed to happen. Persia was built on certainty, on the belief that resistance was temporary, that defeat was inevitable, that time always favoured the empire. From Anatolia to Mesopotamia, from Egypt to the Indus, that belief had held true, until Greece, until 10,000 Spartans took the memory of 300 dead men and transformed it into a weapon. Thermopylae had been meant to terrify the Greek world. Xerxes had ordered Leonidas's body mutilated and displayed as a warning. He believed fear would do what force had not. that it would shatter Greek resolve permanently. Instead, it hardened it, and Sparta, more than any other city, understood the message beneath the horror. The Persians had revealed how they thought, how they fought, how they assumed victory was already written. The Spartans understood something else too, that the most dangerous moment for an empire is not when it is challenged, but when it believes the challenge is over. At Plataea, Persia did not march into battle cautiously. It surged forward, convinced it was witnessing retreat, convinced the Greeks were unravelling exactly as expected, convinced that Thermopylae had already decided the outcome of the war. That confidence blinded them. The Spartans did not shout when they advanced. They did not need to. Their silence carried more weight than any war cry. It told the Persians everything they needed to know, too late. This was not a battle of desperation, it was a correction. And when the Persian line collapsed, it did not collapse because the Spartans were stronger, faster, or more numerous. It collapsed because Persia could not comprehend an enemy that refused to behave as expected. That lesson echoed far beyond the battlefield. In the decades that followed, Persia would remain powerful, wealthy, vast. But its aura was gone, its inevitability shattered. No longer could it rely on reputation alone to break resistance. Every future enemy now knew something critical. Persia could be beaten, and Sparta became something else entirely. No longer just a feared city-state, no longer merely an austere warrior society. Sparta became a symbol of endurance, discipline, and consequence. The city that had lost 300 men without breaking, the city that had waited, planned, returned, and finished what it started. But victory came with a cost. The same discipline that allowed Sparta to defeat Persia would later isolate it. The same rigidity that crushed imperial armies would make it slow to adapt in a changing Greek world. Athens would rise. Alliances would fracture. Former brothers in arms would turn their spears on one another. History would move on. Yet Thermopylae and Plataea would never be separated. One without the other tells the wrong story. Thermopylae without Plataea is tragedy without meaning. Plataea without Thermopylae is victory without context. Together they reveal something far more unsettling. That sacrifice is not the end of resistance. It is the beginning of strategy. Leonidas did not die to stop Persia. He died to teach Sparta how to kill it. And the 10,000 did exactly that. They took the lesson, written in blood in a mountain pass, and carried it into open ground, where empire could no longer hide behind numbers or reputation. They forced Persia to fight on terms it did not understand, against men who had already accepted death, and therefore could not be intimidated by it. In the end, the Spartans did not just avenge Thermopylae, they erased its humiliation. They turned loss into leverage. And they proved the truth that history repeats again and again, though empires never seem to learn it. Power is not broken by resistance alone. It is broken when resistance remembers. On the field where 10,000 Spartans stood, the shadow of 300 finally lifted, not because they were forgotten, but because their sacrifice had achieved its final purpose. The mountain pass had delayed an empire. The open plain destroyed its confidence. And from that moment forward, the world understood something Persia never did. That even the greatest forces in history are vulnerable. Not when they are challenged, but when they believe the challenge is already over. As the dust settled on the plains of Greece, the echoes of that war did not fade with the bodies on the field. They lingered in the silence that followed, heavy, unsettling, irreversible. The 300 at Thermopylae had shown the world how men could die. The 10,000 who followed showed it how empires fall, not in a single moment of glory, but through memory, discipline, and a refusal to forget what was taken. Persia lost more than an army that day. It lost certainty. It lost the illusion that history moved in only one direction. And Sparta, for all its later failures and contradictions, proved something that still unsettles the powerful. That defeat, when remembered and understood, can become more dangerous than victory. Thermopylae was meant to end resistance. Instead, it taught resistance how to endure. And when endurance met patience, and patience met resolve, the result was not sacrifice, but reckoning, because history is not shaped by those who strike first. It is shaped by those who survive long enough to strike back. If this story held your attention, if you felt the weight of those moments and the silence between them, there are countless more turning points like this buried in history, battles where the outcome reshaped civilizations and decisions made in a single day echoed for centuries. Subscribe now and join us as we uncover the wars, strategies, and moments of defiance that changed the course of the world.